All right, everyone, good morning. Thank you for being here so early. I was actually expecting attendees to be basically the presenters and Pedro, so I'm very happy to see more faces than that. I'm also very happy to be here, both as an alumnus, but also as a Brazilianist, because I feel that I'm very much in the best company with my co-panelists and, of course, with many of you as well. So I actually had structured comments and a presentation that was very domesticated. And then after yesterday's panel, I decided to do a little reviravoltas and to spice things up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a relatively structured introduction, and then depending on how much time I have, I'm going to go a little bit more wild and then throw some ideas and course through the 100 or so slides that I have there just in case. So I've titled my talk today Mirrors and Mirages, as a subtitle, I wasn't sure about how many theses I wanted to try to list in my head. So I just left it pretty much open with some theses, in part because I want to use this as an opportunity not to commemorate something exact and definite, but rather to play with the multiple possible significances that this bicentennial could have. And so I'll start with the question of what do we mean when we commemorate 200 years of relations between Brazil and the United States. As we were reminded yesterday, this bicentennial marks the precise moment in which the Brazilian Chargé d'Affaires, José Silvestre Rebelo, was received by US President James Monroe on May 1824. And so this became a de facto form of recognition of Brazilian independence. Of course, a lot has occurred since then, and there's all sorts of occurrences that aggregate through time, but this initial moment of engagement remains very much cloaked in a very kind of ponderous significance, to the point that most of us feel the need to start there. Now, the problem with that is that this significance that accrues through time is also problematic because it also raises questions about the need to distinguish between memorialization and historicization. And so, of course, as a historian, I'm going to try my best to aim for the latter. I want to historicize rather than memorialize, because I believe that memorializing puts us in a pretty tricky spot. If we memorialize without historicizing, we risk losing sight of more or less minor but very important details. So among the less minor details, for instance, US recognition actually came after the Monroe Doctrine. This is something that was mentioned yesterday. And the Monroe Doctrine was intended to shield Latin American republics from European intervention at a time of great revolutionary unrest. But Brazil was no republic, as we all know. Brazil came to a sovereignty of its own as a monarchy and as a new world empire, no less. A more minor detail than that is that if we really wanted to commemorate US-Brazilian engagements, we'd actually have to go all the way back at least to the Inconfidencia Mineira, one of whose conspirators under the pen name of Vendek had actually befriended and corresponded with Thomas Jefferson in France. In addition to that, we'd also have to include kind of like this explosive combination of Republican ideas and maritime trade routes that delivered a lot of problems to the Brazilian Northeast in the first decades of the 19th century, and also the last years of the 18th. So, for example, we can think about ideas coming in from the US and their influence on the Revolta dos Alfaiates in Bahia, but we can also think about the Pernambucan Revolt of 1817, and of course, the possibility of what one historian has called another independence in the short-lived Confederação do Equador in 1824. So in other words, there are all sorts of the points of departure that we can think about before this more official one of the recognition of a chargé d'affaires. So with this disclaimer in mind, what I want to do today is just brainstorm, if you will, about the implications and the significance of recognition between what I consider to be the two potentates of the 19th century Americas. And of course, when I talk about recognition, I'm going to try to think about this recognition as something that occurred mutually, because just referring to Rebelo himself already puts us at the spot of centering the United States as a power that concedes recognition, and Brazil as a subservient power that needs it, right? So most of my thoughts are actually tangential to my just published book, Peopling for Profit in Imperial Brazil. And so I'm also kind of like veering away from some of its ideas and its overall structure, because I also want to experiment a little bit. But I do want to preserve this type of approach that I very much practice in this book of cultivating a Brazil in the world perspective. And this is something that I think a lot of my colleagues, including Miqueias Mugia and Isadora Mota, also practice in their own way. Now, in my book, what I try to do is look at state formation through the prism of migration policy development, if you want the summary in a nutshell. And today, that's what I initially was going to do. I was going to look at migration policy and counterpoints between the US and Brazil, because in large part, this was actually an incredibly fruitful platform for engagement between the US and Brazil in the 19th century. I am very much informed by a very robust historiography for the United States that has looked both at migration concerns and migration policies in the 19th century as formative of the nation state, but also more recently as, looking at the interplay of slavery and migration as a very problematic type of pairing. And I'm thinking of Kevin Candy's book that just came out a little bit under a year ago. And so what I try to do is go to Brazil and try to divorce a pairing that has long been naturalized, namely the idea that slavery and migration promotion went hand in hand and existed in this inversely proportional relationship throughout the 19th century. What I choose to do instead is look at directed migration policies and colonization policies, so migration and settlement, in an empire-wide basis, particularly because I want to make the point that Brazil, of course, was very much that 19th century empire, right? And so when I think about Brazil as an empire, I have my task is basically laid out before me, because it's not an easy hill to climb, considering that the vast and very rich historiography of empires in the US and in Europe tends to exclude Brazil as this type of old regime flotsam or exceptional fluke following the age of revolutions. And so I want to, place Brazil up there with other 19th century empires, particularly next to the United States. But I also want to think about what dynamics distinguish Brazil by its own right. Now, when I'm thinking about US-Brazil relationships in this context, I'm very cognizant that there are already pretty established narratives. So I'm going to run you through a relatively easy narrative of what happened after recognition. And I want to say that it's only relatively easy because there's all this incredible groundwork that has been done by some fellow historians. So as many of you know, the United States was among the first countries to recognize Brazil, but in the following decades, the Northern Republic and the Austral Empire actually became the leading and increasingly solitary slave powers in the American hemisphere. Interestingly, scholars have recently uncovered different tendencies in the relationship among politicians from both countries during those following decades, and I just want to highlight three salient ones here and build on them. Some scholars, such as Matthew Karp, have looked at the relationship between these jingoistic US diplomats that arrived in Brazil, particularly those who harbored intentions of promoting a Southern navalism, And this was, of course, a very tense relationship because Brazilian statesmen chafed at their presence. Other scholars, such as Roberto Saba, have challenged that view to say that these Brazilian politicians actually turn more towards northern reformers and modernizers. A lot of you may have heard, for example, of the book Brazil and the Brazilians by James Cooley Fletcher. So that's kind of like the epitome of what modernizing Brazilian elites were trying to look at. And then other scholars, such as Luciana da Cruz Brito, have also looked at how this was a two-way street and how what was happening in Brazil, the different racial dynamics, the different capitalist dynamics actually came back to the United States and served to shape a reflection on what a post-emancipation, but also possible slavery futures could look like. And so these are incredibly productive routes of analysis. And what I do is basically advance four theses. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up. The fourth thesis that I wanted to propose is they're very much based particularly on Roberto Saba's take on American Mirror, this idea that Brazil and the United States, starting in the 1870s, are going to become these reciprocal partners in implementing modernizing reforms, and particularly in developing mechanization of different industries. And so what I want to propose is, number one, that if we take this idea of mirroring, first of all, we have to expect that at some points, the image that is going to be returned in the mirror is actually a mirage and not quite a mirror. And in addition to that, we're going to see that sometimes it's a different mirror that these two empires were looking at, depending on the time in the 19th century. So thesis number one, I want to propose that there is a moment in which that mirror is a convex mirror. That means that when Brazil and the United States looked at that mutual mirror, what they saw were two state systems that had developed inversely proportional governance structures. On the one hand, Brazil was a heavily centralized imperial system, and on the other hand, the United States was a republic that was always battling that impetus to centralize versus decentralize. So in migration controls and policy alone, that's where I see that centralization drive in the Brazilian empire most evidently. Number two, I want to suggest that at times, very exceptionally, there was an actual mirror. And in particular, I want to think about the 1830s and what I refer to as the speculative turn that took a hold of Brazilian society based on the notion of a spirit of association. This is basically another way of speaking about commercial associationalism and speculation. This is an idea that is based on, as far as I've been able to ascertain, Alexandre Delaborde book of 1818. Here we have the third edition of 1834, which is actually published in the midst of the Brazilian Regency. And so I want to think about how ideas about speculation and associationalism trickle down to Brazil in some ways, thanks to José Silvestre Rebelo himself, who comes back to Brazil to lead the Sociedade Auxiliadora da Indústria Nacional, the biggest industrial and commercial lobby of the time in Brazil. And he authors, in addition to editing the journal of this association, he also authors this piece called Memória sobre a necessidade de se criarem sociedades entre os homens, and goes on to use rivers as this metaphor for commercial speculation. So immediately, this speculative turn becomes also this way of exploring the potential of Brazilian hinterlands for other forms of speculation, particularly landed property speculation, even though I know when I'm saying that landed property had not been coded yet, right? There was no codification of it yet. But here, for example, we have Raimundo da Cunha Matos, a very important politician of the time, trying to think about rivers as waterways that connect the Rio Doce, Jequitinhonha, different parts of Minas, all the way with Salvador. And then we also have, the Pires expedition in the Rio Doce, which also occurs at the same time in the 1830s. Now, I'm out of time, so I'm gonna just run you through the other two theses, and maybe in the Q&A I can give you some more details about them. The third thesis I have is that there's also a moment of false mirroring. In the 1860s, there's another turn that I refer to as the imperial turn, both in the United States and in Brazil, in which, through the crucible of war, the US emancipates and Brazil postpones. And so we have kind of like a schism here in which these two reciprocating empires start heading in a different way. And lastly, I want to propose as my fourth and last thesis that there's also a rear view mirror in which these mutually reinforcing empires ultimately gave way to the consolidation of an imperial republic in the United States and a faltering decentralized republic in Brazil. And so we have this moment of parting ways at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century that is also very interesting, and that to me serves to think about present-day relationships between Brazil and the United States, in which the United States continues to be such a strong reference point for Brazil, but we don't have the converse necessarily always being true. We don't have a similarly omnipresent reference to Brazil in US politics, for instance, or in US society at large. And of course, as a Brazilianist, I also see that in this back and forth on the part of the US, really, on visa policies, right? The fact that the United States remains entrenched in this idea that anyone who comes to the United States from Brazil has to undergo this very lengthy and difficult process for obtaining a visa, which already, for me, presupposes a form of class selection as well, of who can come to the United States from Brazil. So I'll leave it there for now, and then in the Q&A, hopefully we can talk about other things. Yeah? Thank you.
For chronological reasons, they are all historians, so they are worried about chronology. Miqueias will be next. Miqueias.
Good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I would like to start expressing my gratitude. I'm really honored to participate finally in a panel with both my esteemed colleagues and good friends, José Juan and Isadora Mota. Special thanks to Carol Dopp, who helped organize this. Unfortunately, she always leaves the room at the right time. And so for her invaluable support, as well as to the consulate in New York, the embassy in DC, we are delighted to have you here with us today. After José Juan's tour de force, I think I will start by saying that my presentation, titled Inclusion Illusions, Henry Euclid's Logbook on 1847 Brazil, tries to people a little bit more the day-to-day engagements of Americans with Brazil in the 19th century. At the inception of this symposium, we invited our panelists to engage in a collective reflection on the relations between Brazil and the United States, broadly speaking, and how they inform their intellectual projects. What I will present today focuses on primary sources. I think most of you know that I'm obsessed with them, that I have been working on with my students since 2019. Engaging critically with rare materials archived at Firestone Library here in Princeton has been a highlight of my experience in the classroom. Each spring semester, my students and I spend 3 weeks carrying out collaborative research projects in the seafloor of Firestone Library. We embark on a journey to Brazil, traversing a vast expanse of time and history through a rich array of primary sources spanning from the 16th to the 20th centuries. The gazes of many travelers guide us through not only Brazilian history, but especially imperial and transatlantic history. In class, we discuss how people set out to new territories and try to make sense of new environments and unfamiliar contexts. Today, we will encounter one such attempt with a specific manuscript that is archived at Firestone. But first, a heads up. What I present today is a work in progress, my first venture into the world of American travelers in Brazil. I will be more than happy to hear your thoughts on this unique historical source during our Q&A session. So let me begin. On March 25, 1847, Henry Weekly, a bank clerk born in Lancaster, Ohio, and resident of Baltimore, Maryland, sharpened his quill pen to write in his diary. The day began with an unexpected occurrence. We were awakened this morning by deafening peals from the hundred churches of the city, and salutes from all men of war in the harbors and the 3 forts, in honor of the anniversary of the signing of the Constitution of the Empire, which also completes 200 years this year. From a privileged position on the Guanabara Bay, Weekly observed the bustling dawn in Brazil's capital city. The traveler was eager to disembark and explore the city further. Dressing hurriedly, he wrote, we went on deck, and the magnificent scenery around Rio burst before our eyes. The summits of the Sugarloaf, the Corcovado, and the other prominent peaks were first enveloped in clouds, but the sun, which had just risen, soon dispelled the mist. I will return to the scene. This is the scene that he saw, and this is part of the drawing in his diary. I will return to the scene shortly. Coming from Baltimore to Norfolk, Virginia, Henry Weekly spent approximately 1 month in Brazil's capital, engaging in a comprehensive exploration of the city's architectural features. His itinerary encompassed a multitude of religious, historical, and artistic sites, from churches to palaces to cathedrals to public square and beaches. The culmination of Weekly's journey was a meticulous 165-page diary. In composing his writings, Weekly drew upon 2 sources of information: his first-hand observations and his prior knowledge of Brazil, which he had accumulated through his readings of a few books, including a bestseller by Methodist Episcopal Reverend Daniel Kidder, a graduate of Wesleyan University and a missionary in Brazil. Following its release in 1845, Kidder's 2-volume work found its way to Weekly's library in Baltimore. Henry Weekly traveled to Brazil on the recommendation of his physician, with the objective of alleviating his pulmonary ailments in a tropical climate. A change of air could potentially provide respite from the headaches and bloody cough that had persisted for quite some time. From the mid-18th century on, the tropics were regarded as a potential beneficial therapeutic environment. New Hippocratic physicians began promoting the notion that a regimen of sea bathing, fresh air, improved domestic and personal hygiene, and gradual acclimatization to the warm weathers could prove beneficial for the health of sedentary classes and indoor professionals. We see this conviction take shape in Weekly's case. When pharmacological interventions proved ineffective, the appeal of a natural tropical setting as a therapeutic option gained traction. Believing that a voyage to the tropics would be his cure, Weekly left his home in Baltimore and boarded the brig Don Juan at the port of Norfolk. He spent 51 days at sea. Upon crossing the equator, he wrote, This has been the first time in more than 6 weeks that I have felt well. I think my cough is decidedly better. Expectoration is more easy and free, and accompanied with but little blood. I found no further references to Weekly's health condition in his diary during his time in Rio, with a brief exception of a description of his experiencing bathing at the Praia Vermelha. Of particular interest here are his notes on life in Rio de Janeiro, a city examined through the lens of a white male foreign gaze. A traveler who encountered individuals he had never seen before, the beauty of nature starkly contrasting with the city and its inhabitants. In his descriptions and commentary, Weekly engages in a debate that was already present in Kidder's work and the writings of many other foreign travelers of the early 19th century, the issue of slavery and racial relations in Brazil. In the Rio of Weekly's diary, enslaved people were everywhere, as were the descendants of Africans who engaged in the social, religious, and civil life of Brazil's capital. For Weekly, Rio de Janeiro became a small research laboratory in written form, where he could study patterns of civility and barbarism. The diary functioned as his field notebook. In 1847, the year of Weekly's visit, the transatlantic slave trade had not yet been completely abolished in Brazil. As a result, the author was able to bear witness to the final moments of what had been the most profitable economic enterprise of 19th century Brazil, right at the busiest port in South America. For example, on April 20th, while searching for the public slave market, he was informed that it was done away with it. Note the passive voice. In lieu of this, now each slave dealer has his private storehouse, he wrote. Notwithstanding this, in the short space of 4 weeks, over 4,000 were landed in Rio. In that year, 1847, approximately 49,000 enslaved people disembarked in Rio, as you can see in this graph. It's no surprise these numbers caught Weekly's attention. He was visiting Rio during the second most active year of the slave trade in the 19th century, surpassed only by 1848. Amidst rumors of the impending prohibition of the Atlantic slave trade, Rio merchants invested heavily, and enslaved African laborers were introduced into the national economy with unprecedented intensity. Weekly stayed in the Lago do Rocio area at a hotel situated on Rua Direita. As he proceeded on his way to Morro do Castelo on March 27th, he observed large gangs of slaves carrying on their heads the bags of coffee, Brazil's main export product, which was in high demand in his fatherland. In fact, 50% of the coffee consumed in the United States at this time came from Brazil. At the Imperial Chapel, the São Bento Monastery, and the Church of São Sebastião, Weekly observed the prevalence of ornate sacred images, watched the commencement of pre-Easter festivities, and annotated the noteworthy participation of Black men and women in public ceremonies, who even carried images of our Savior, he noted. In the commercial center of the Brazilian Empire, all social mechanisms depended on the exploitation of enslaved labor and enslaved bodies. The sound of this tropical urban space were overwhelming to the senses of the traveler. I quote, "I have looked in vain for anything resembling the American Sabbath. All was noise and confusion." Weekly's feelings of superiority were turning towards constantly, from religion to city planning to the system of government. Strolled about the city during the morning. The more I see of the city, the less I like it. It is one of those places which look much better in travelers' accounts than in reality. From Kidder's sketches, I had drawn my ideas of Rio, and making all allowances, my expectations had risen high, and my disappointment was great. The scenery surrounding the city is certainly most magnificent, and on the other hand, the city itself might be made the queen of the Western Hemisphere, but under its present government, never. The interpretive framework activated by Henry Weekly in his logbook generated a benevolent view of slavery in Brazil, a common perspective among Americans in the mid-19th century. On the one hand, he supported the argument that almost all enslaved individuals could attain freedom if they desired and worked for it, given the widespread practice of purchasing manumission letters. On the other hand, according to Weekly, his position as a witness to slavery in its actual operation allowed him to claim that the proposals of the abolitionists are impracticable and fanatical. For the Orthodox Christian Weekly, the transatlantic slave trade was justifiable, as it provided Africans a means of escape from their perceived savage lives and an opportunity for them to serve under the Christian rule. Weekly aligned his ideas with a mainstream biblical interpretation that was used to justify slavery in the Atlantic world. In drawing on the letters of Paul, particularly Ephesians 6 and Colossians 3, he asserted that enslaved individuals should be loyal to their masters and fear Christ in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. These texts, as historian Michael Taylor notes, comprised a major part of the arsenal of pro-slavery Christianity. Thus, for Weekly, as for other Christians on both sides of the Atlantic, earthly slavery in Brazil was seen as an intermediate stage between barbarism and salvation. To conclude, I would like to return to the day of Henry Weekly's arrival in Rio, March 25th, 1847, the anniversary of the promulgation of the 1824 Brazilian Constitution, the one that remained silent on slave trade and slavery and limited access to citizenship for freed Africans, effectively excluding them from the body of the nation. As he disembarked from the Don Juan, Weekly noticed something unusual happening at the surroundings of the imperial palace. Something had caught him by surprise. We landed at Palace Square, which was at the time filled with troops, going through their various evolutions. That part of the spectacle which I was most forcibly struck, he wrote, was the extensive variety in the complexions of both officers and men, from very fair complexion to the deepest shades of Ethiopian blackings. In several instances, I saw officers of apparently pure African blood commanding troops composed of both whites and blacks. For an American accustomed to an armed citizenry restricted to white men in the United States, witnessing the multicolored militia parade was a significant shock, one that may have influenced his exaggerated writing style. By highlighting the many color differences he observed, the narrator sought to emphasize the inclusivity of Brazilian society in comparison to what he experienced in America. However, this passage, written on the first day of his stay in Brazil, obviously failed to account for the intricate nuances of how pervasive militarization of society could shape citizenship in a country. The direct relationship between the military status and layered citizenship created partial frontiers in Brazil, which helped generate durable inequalities. This excerpt from Weekly diary reminded me so much of Luiz Gama's poem Guarda Nacional. In contrast to Weekly's limited view, the satirical poem written by one of Brazil's most talented black jurists regarded the armed forces as a new captivity for the Brazilian poor, perceiving it as an onerous burden that most people were unable to bear. Gama's work provides an accurate diagnosis of the mechanisms through which the armed forces perpetuated inequality. The militias not only divided Brazilians between citizens and non-citizens, or guardsmen and non-guardsmen, but also created internal distinctions among popular groups. And here I quote Luiz Gama. When Brazil was still in its infancy, struggling to claim the rights of a nation, and the people, poor souls in their confusion, gave in to the cunning, to the trickster, they built for themselves a whipping post, where they would be tied with disgrace. That post, it's the Imperial Guard, created to save it from shame, a scourge that seems infernal, and which they call national. And for the free Brazilian people, a new captivity was established. The open ranks of the pervasive militia assisted the elites in organizing a society in a manner that allowed almost everyone to feel superior to someone else, in the words of Richard Graham. In Brazil, the militia's influence extended far beyond the waging of wars. It played a pivotal role in the hierarchical structuring of society, not only segregating the male population into citizens and non-citizens, but also engendering a multitude of internal distinctions. This first incursion into Weekly's diary reveals a traveler who inscribed his fears, doubts, and insecurities on his writings. Codifying his new surroundings, Weekly tried to control a new living environment through signifiers he was familiarized with. The decaying institution of slavery, for him, was acceptable, thanks to his own religious beliefs. In other words, Weekly was a traveler that tried to make sense of present pasts. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Bom dia. It's a pleasure to be back here in the Brazil Lab with you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. With you today. And I just wanted to thank the Brazil Lab for the invitation, and also mention how thrilled I am to be dividing this panel with José Juan and Miqueias. I would dare say that we are kind of the same generation of scholars working on Brazil, and we share some of the same preoccupations, some of the same questions. I think you're going to see how you can see today how our work resonates with each other. And hopefully what I'm going to talk about today can also convey the imprint that they both have on my work. We've been talking about these themes for a long time. Okay. So in taking the provocation with which Jose Juan started the panel, I would like to continue to reflect with you today about a more diffuse beginning, perhaps, of U.S. and Brazil relations. And by that, I mean that, I really think that we need to reflect further about the past that we share. And we can understand this relationship differently if we bring it to not only to the level of the world of slavery, right, the slave past that we share, but if we go back to the thoughts of enslaved peoples themselves and how is it that they conceived of the relationships between the two countries. So here at Princeton, I teach what we call modern Brazilian history, but I see myself first and foremost as a scholar of slavery in the Atlantic world who specializes in 19th century Brazil. So I take seriously the fact that the nation was not the only context for Black experiences in the 19th century. And that, therefore, I approach Brazil from a transnational standpoint that tries to illuminate not only the inner workings of Brazilian society, but also the country's place in the Afro-Atlantic in the 19th century world. And the global reach of chattel slavery and the slave trade in the 19th century has led me to pursue Brazil's entanglements, especially with the United States, Great Britain, and the rest of Latin America in the mid-19th century. So let me take you back to the beautiful horizon of Rio de Janeiro, just to criticize weeklies here as a carioca. I am deeply offended. But let's go back to 19th century Brazil. I wanted to just before I start and rush through what I have to say today, I just wanted to mention that these are some of the central questions that drive my scholarship. This is what I'm interested in when I think about U.S. and Brazil relations. How did enslaved peoples, in this case in Brazil, imagine freedom during the so-called Age of Abolition? Given that the end of slavery spread unevenly throughout the Americas, as Jose Juan mentioned, it came first to the US and then to Brazil, how did Africans and their descendants craft their visions of liberation in relation to the geopolitics of global abolition? So in very simple words, if they are living in an empire where slavery is still vibrant by the time that most of the Americas is already free, how is it that you struggle for freedom and seize on these ideas, these movements, and the struggles of other African descendants throughout the Americas to, fight for freedom in Brazil? So this is the central question that drives my work. And what I try to do is to envision enslaved peoples themselves as producers of knowledge and social change in the Americas. That is, as peoples who practice of freedom, peoples whose practice of freedom holds lessons for the study of the Americas past and present. And here, I think, is where the relationships between Brazil and the US become very important from a very specific point of view. Brazil gets mentioned very commonly in US historiography and literature, as we've just seen with the work of Miqueias, as a bastion of slavery in the Americas. But Brazil also shares a past with the United States as a cradle for Black freedom struggles. And that's where I want to take us today. I would argue that diplomatic history is also the product of the experiences of Africans and Afro-descendants whose transnational journeys laid the groundwork for the hemispheric connections that we are preoccupied with here. Ultimately, these non-state actors fashioned abolitionism in Brazil by seizing on the U.S. Civil War, as I'm going to show you to you today, as a war for Black freedom everywhere slavery existed. So this is the thrust of the book I have now finally finished, which is called Freedom's Horizon, Black Abolitionism in 19th Century Brazil, coming out in the beginning of next year. What is this? It was not supposed to be that. So let's keep it here. And this book traces the development of what I call Black abolitionism as a grassroots movement that originated in the senzalas and quilombos of Brazil and was very much connected to a hemispheric Black radical tradition. So let me give you some examples of that today to kind of unpack what it means and to show you how is it that I've been approaching relationships between US and Brazil. I wanted to invite you to go back with me to the 1860s and try to envision Brazil as a battlefront of the US Civil War. So here we are. I'll try to go fast, and I'm happy to give you more information in the Q&A. But in August of 1861, Emperor Pedro II declared Brazil's neutrality in the US Civil War, seeking to align the empire with European policy of respecting Abraham Lincoln's blockade, but granting the Confederates belligerent status. So Brazil, during the 1860s, during the US Civil War, maintained diplomatic relations with the Washington government, but sought to reconcile impartiality, neutrality in the conflict with what Brazilian officials called the duties of hospitality which humanity demands. So whenever a Confederate cruiser reached the shores of Brazil during the 1860s, they often secured provisions, they were able to refuel, they landed prisoners, they were received by the Brazilian government. And it's that story that I want to talk about. Brazilian authorities on the Brazilian coast really struggled to adhere to a neutral stance during the US Civil War, because what was at stake during the 1860s in the US was very dear to Brazil. It's the future of slavery, right? So during the 1860s, what happened was that Union merchant ships were traveling to the coast of Brazil. Sometimes they were just traveling, going around South America to get to the Pacific. Sometimes they were here just trading. But sometimes they also came in search and pursuit of Confederate cruisers, and the other way around. The Confederates sent many ships to Brazil in pursuit of the Union merchant navy. And what happened is that during the 1860s, these ships confronted and battled one another on the coast of Brazil. And that generated a string of naval incidents that were not only, important for Brazil-U.S. relations on a diplomatic kind of high-level dimension, but that profoundly impacted the struggles for freedom of the enslaved in Brazil. So these incidents embroiled Brazil in the war, changing the context for Black struggles, freedom struggles in Brazil. Enslaved peoples who were, the majority living in these coastal towns, gauged the odds of abolition by witnessing armed confrontations between Union and Confederate vessels along the Brazilian coast, where steamers like the CSS Sumter, the U.S. Powhatan, and the CSS Alabama landed prisoners, captured and told war prizes at their convenience, recruited crew members, and even engaged the Brazilian Navy in the crossfires of sectional clashes. They also assessed the unfolding story of emancipation in the United States through information circuits where literate Blacks read newspapers aloud for their peers and discussed the implications of the sectional war to Brazilian abolition. So part of my work has to do with understanding how is it that some enslaved peoples that were literate in Brazil were reading about the US Civil War on the newspapers and then organizing what I call an insurgent tradition in Brazil, according to this idea that the US Civil War liberated not only enslaved peoples in the US, but Black people everywhere slavery existed. But here, I wanted to just mention really quickly some of these maritime incidents that happened on the coast of Brazil, because they influenced or inspired slave rebellions in the country during the 1860s. Here you can see the CSS Center and the Powhatan in Maranhão. This is one of the most well-known, important. It was not an incident because the ships missed each other, but the CSS Center was a Confederate cruiser, the first one to what is it called? To escape the blockade of the Mississippi River and descend into the South Atlantic. And it arrived in Brazil in September of 1861. And once it was at the shore of São Luís in Maranhão, enslaved peoples noticed the presence of this ship. And people like Agostinho, who was an enslaved man in Anajatuba, a little town, south of São Luís, imagined that ship, even though it was a Confederate cruiser, but it was a North American ship that was there to disembark troops who would fight in support of abolition in Brazil. That's the kind of impact that I'm talking about. The other kind of impact the Civil War had in Brazil has to do also with how is it that it shaped public discourse and public opinion during the 1860s. One of the most famous Confederate cruisers of the Civil War, the Alabama, the CSS Alabama, came to Brazil, especially to the northeast of Brazil, towed and burned a lot of Union whale ships. And it became so famous that a newspaper was created in Bahia in 1863 with its name, right? And this newspaper, the whole gist of it is that the editor pretends that it's talking about Brazilian politics from the Alabama itself, from his on board of the ship, and looking from the point of view of this kind of pirate, this cruiser, into the political life of Brazil. So this is another way to think about the impact of the Civil War. And I know that I need to conclude, but I just wanted to mention probably the most impactful maritime incident during the US Civil War happened in Salvador, Bahia in 1864. When the Union ship Wachusett actually towed, and here you can see that happening in the Bay of Alcém, right? The Wachusett is towing the Confederate ship. The Union and the Confederates battled with each other. There were many casualties during that day, especially on the Confederate side. This was seen by the Brazilians as a scandal, a threat to Brazilian sovereignty. But the enslaved people that lived in Bahia, in Salvador, were all over it and talking about the possibility that the Americans had again come to Brazil to help in their struggle to liberate the slaves. And I'm just going to point to that because that's the Brazilian representation. I have nothing to do with that. But this is the consul of Brazil at the time, the consul of the United States of Washington, in Brazil at the time, Thomas Wilson, who is depicted here as a dog or cat. You can decide what he is. Because Brazilians made fun of him because given the confusion that this created and the diplomatic incidents that it created, Thomas Wilson escaped Brazil on board of the Wachusett. He just left his post and came back to the U.S. In 1864. So the Brazilians depicted him as someone that didn't really stand for what happened. This was a breach of kind of international relations here, and he left Salvador at that time. Okay, this incident became a huge scandal, very famous, also portrayed in the American press, and I'm happy to share more about it with you if you are curious about that. So, in conclusion, when it comes to U.S.-Brazil relations and during the Civil War era in particular, I think my contribution would be to call attention to enslaved peoples as interlocutors in the hemispheric debate about the future of slavery. So this debate is happening, in Brazilian society in a much wider way that we sometimes tend to admit. What existed as a threat to slave-holding elites also spoke of a different geographical story about emancipation. In this case, a story that linked Brazil and the U.S. in a very specific sense, right? From the perspective of Africans and Afro-descendants in Brazil. The words of Afro-Brazilians familiar with the Civil War show that the conflict integrated a kind of vernacular knowledge of 19th century reform that defies the disciplinary, geographic, and linguistic boundaries often applied to the study of abolition. By shifting the focus to the lived experience of the enslaved, Black abolitionism in Brazil, and by Black abolitionism, I'm talking about this tradition of fighting for freedom in Brazil, sometimes inspired by these specific readings about the uneven spread of abolition in the world. By shifting the focus to Black abolitionism, we can get to a different perspective on a historical account, typically written from an Anglophone perspective, or from the point of view of the state and the high echelons of different governments. Black abolitionism, as I argue, was both a lived experience and a political movement, originating also in Brazil, and built on the grassroots level by self-liberating peoples who thought of freedom as a phenomenon that connected Blacks everywhere slavery existed. I'll stop here, and thank you for your attention.
I really enjoyed, how there has been a crescendo of the presence of slavery, which is the fundamental stone of what the three of you were speaking about. But I will open up to questions. We're sort of running out of time, so let's try to do 10 to 15. Yep.
Sorry. We had the mic. Before the recording.
What were two U.S. ships doing in Bahia?
Well, do I answer?
Yeah, I would suggest, in the spirit of the Brazil Lab, a bundle of questions.
I could feel it coming.
Yeah, João always does that. Uma basket de flores. So let's collect a few questions and then get back to the panelists. If there are questions. Okay, we do have a question.
Can you hear me? Oh, good. I'm just curious how, in the United States, I was born near Gettysburg, so this idea of independence being really more of a war of industrialization versus the South, or, rather than ideological as we discuss it more in common. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the industrialization markets between Brazil and the United States, and how that might have influenced abolitionism or the relationships between the countries.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentations. I have a common question. I don't know if it makes sense for you, but it makes for me. The idea of, I was astonished how you, three of you, showed images of boats and talked about rivers, no? The importance of rivers. And I remember that the first public, can I say concours in the Instituto Histórico Geográfico Brasileiro
Competition?
competition was
Contest.
the winner was Von Martius in the 30s, 30s, and the idea was that Brazil was a big river composed by three different rivers, not common rivers. A very big, robust Black River, not so robust. White River, not so robust Black River, and even tiny one, Indigenous River. And I was amazed how, for example, you talked about rivers and this idea of communication, connection and disconnection. I also heard about mirrors. I want to have your opinion about Espelho de Próspero. No, this book's so important, talking about mirrors and about the idea that the mirror does not give us an equal representation of both countries. So in this sense, and I want to hear you more about diplomacy in the 19th century, how you have a very democratic river, or not just so democratic river, in this space, the Afro-Atlantic space, that we know that it was a very deep space, and also a river, no, called Atlantic, no, in the sense that it could have flux and deflux, no? How do you think about it?
One more.
I have two brief questions to Isadora. Regarding José Bonifácio de Andrade Silva in 1823, when he made his presentation projects for Brazil, he defended the abolishment, the emancipation of slavery. So how did it also impact the ideas in Brazil of the time? And also for José Juan, there is an interesting aspect of pre-Civil War regarding some Americans believing that, or defending the idea that the Amazon River was part of the Mississippi River. And that was an episode that's little known for Brazilians, but it's very interesting. And after the Confederates lost the war, the idea disappeared, at least at that time. But suddenly, in the end of the 20th century to 21st century, it starts again this idea of then Amazon being something international and so belongs to the world. So how do you see this rebirth of this idea of the Mississippi being a part of the Mississippi River and now Amazon being part of the world? Thank you.
So back to you.
You gentlemen just making me speak first. Got it. Okay. About the ships in Bahia. Oh well. The Confederacy sent many ships, many cruisers, to the shores of Brazil, to what they claimed were international waters at the time, but actually they were within 200 leagues, right, of the Brazilian coast, so they were in Brazilian territory. And they sent them there in pursuit of the Union Merchant Navy. So they were burning, towing, attacking Union ships on the shore of Brazil, especially the Union whalers that came to Brazil, and especially to the south, where whaling was very important. And at that time in Bahia, we had, between Bahia and Pernambuco, they really liked to sometimes spend some time around Fernando de Noronha, close to Pernambuco, and then they would, from there, organize their missions down the Atlantic, we had, as you saw, the Florida, the Confederate ships, like the Florida, the Georgia. What was the other one? I now forget. Oh, the Alabama, right? And they were all doing the work of, they were all doing warfare in Brazilian waters. So what happened in 1864 in Bahia was just one example of many others that happened throughout Brazil, and that includes, the more kind of northern coast of Brazil, like Maranhão, and also like Belém, coming, to Pernambuco, to Bahia, even to Santa Catarina in the south. And I didn't have time to mention, but the Alabama, the newspaper that was created in Bahia in 1863, had an enemy, another newspaper that was created at the time, which was in Bahia, which was called the Mohican, another ship, this time a Union ship that had come to Brazil. And the idea that they would, the Mohican and the Alabama were kind of barreling for the last word about politics in Salvador, Bahia, but recreating, the sectional conflict in the Brazilian press, so to speak. So it's a very interesting story in the 1860s. About the, you're right, Lily. So much of this story, in the case that I presented, the circulation of ideas between the two countries and the circulation of ideas among enslaved peoples happened through this maritime world and also through the rivers of Brazil. In this case, in 1861, in Maranhão, Agostinho, the enslaved man that was charged as like the leader of the slave rebellion, he was actually a hired out slave, a escravo de ganho, who went to São Luís one day, saw the ship, and then he took a boat back to Anajatuba, to this town south of São Luís, and then spread the word among the enslaved in this town that the Americans were coming and they were going to support their slave rebellion. So the circulation of information happened through rivers, and I think what is interesting to think about in this case is that, yes, Brazil was very much Atlantic facing during the Civil War era, during the 1860s, but the enslaved did a lot of the work of carrying information inland through the rivers of Brazil, and that's how, for example, we have slave rebellions inspired by the U.S. Civil War happening in the middle of the Amazon in 1865, for example, right? So they really troubled this geography of Brazil at the time because that's where the information is coming inland. And about José Bonifácio, so in 23, Bonifácio presented a project to the then Constituent Assembly of Brazil, proposing the gradual emancipation of the enslaved in Brazil in a very far future. And I think in some ways, Bonifácio represented this liberal elite in Brazil of the time, that some of them could conceive of the end of slavery in a very faraway future, but an end of slavery that was, I think, controlled by the imperial government, right? And that was gradual in form, right? It would take many years and probably a long legislative process to come to pass. What the enslaved are doing at the same time in Brazil, though, and I talked about the 1860s, but I could take it to the 1820s, is something very different. They are demanding immediate emancipation, not gradual, right? So I would say they are the representatives of a radical tradition that doesn't necessarily get mentioned in the history books at that time. They are the only ones in Brazil actually struggling for immediate emancipation, right? And pushing forward these legislative efforts to outlaw slavery at some point in Brazil. Now you go.
Can I use images? Of course. Is it? Do I just click on my?
It's very.
Yeah, I'll try to do it very, very fast. But you thought I was kidding when I said 100 slides.
He wasn't.
So this is why it's good to have some extra images. Let me start with the Amazon in the U.S. Because it's actually something that was part of that book that just came out. But actually, I took it out, and it's now one of the books I'm working on at the present. How did Amazon open up before the rubber boom? Right? We have a really good understanding of the Amazon as this colonial frontier for reforms under Pombal. And then we have this image of the Amazon as, the place where basically, coffee, sugar, and then rubber, right? And so this is a genetic moment in the reconceptualization of the Amazon, particularly because one of those southern jingoists, right, Matthew Fontaine-Maury, he sends this expedition to the Amazon. And, this is something I encourage everyone to do. Go to the University of Wisconsin and Milwaukee's map collection, which is digitized. Look at Maury's maps, because before he was a jingoist, he was actually a fantastic cartographer. And these are incredibly beautiful maps. This is Brazil right here. And so you have Marajó right there. And the interesting thing is that for him, it's not the Amazon just as an agricultural frontier. If you actually look at the text of his report, what he's actually thinking about is wind patterns. And so what he's doing is comparing the Mississippi and the Amazon, and his idea is that the Amazon has such a force and is so favored by wind patterns in the Atlantic that it would, in some ways, prefigure a great acceleration, to use one of the terms that historians use for the second half of the 19th century. And so what he's saying is that if, we send some Southerners down there, they're not only going to produce, cotton, they're also going to be able to transport it and trade in it with unprecedented speed to all places in the Atlantic, even more than the Mississippi, which kind of bumps into Cuba, basically. And so that's one interesting aspect about that. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting is to think about this other question about the Civil War as a form of industrialization. And I thank you for that question. It's I think you're right on. Roberto Saba is really good at unearthing some of those connections. For instance, talking about William Van Vleck Lidgerwood, who is one of the New Jersey connections that I was hoping to bring up today. He's from Morristown, New Jersey. He's part of this. He's one of the scions of this industrial family. And of course, if you've been to Campinas, you know that the Lidgerwoods, there's the Fundição Lidgerwood. But interestingly, this is a family that became a global industrial dynasty. Closest to us, you can think about the Lidgerwood Manufacturing Company in Red Hook in Brooklyn, which in many ways was bankrolled by, with the help of the business that the Lidgerwoods had in Brazil, furnishing, machinery, coffee haulers in particular, to planters in Campinas, especially the reformist sons of those planters. And so this is a really good example also of how Brazil feeds back into the US, and it's a two-way street. The Lidgerwood Emporium ended up supplying machinery and technologies for subways, for the Panama Canal, for dams in Australia, in California. This is something that Roberto Saba unearths, and it's very important and very interesting. In my own case, I think that there's also a reform that the post-war, the post-Civil War, gives an opening for, and it's basically one that allows young, up-and-coming political figures like Quintino Bocaiúva, who you see here. He's going to be one of those top Republicans in the 1890s, but the post-war in the U.S. gives him a schooling on not only what types of migration policies can be tried in Brazil, but also how to run migration as a business. So he actually goes to hire and recruit migrants to go to Brazil. We, of course, know about the Confederados. That's actually relatively well studied nowadays. But Quintino Bocaiúva also demonstrates that it's not just about industrialization and mechanization. If we think about what's going on during the U.S. Civil War and the post-war, it's also about windows of opportunity that demonstrate that Brazil and the U.S. cannot be thought about as engaging in a bilateral relationship. I always think, and this is my slogan for understanding 19th century diplomacy, that it takes three to tango at the very least. That there's always at least a trilateral relationship, and it's always a multilateral one. And in the case of Quintino Bocayuva, the Cuban exiled community in New York City was crucial, not only to set up the first steamship line between New York and Brazil, but also to leave someone in place when Quintino Bocayuva returns to Brazil and basically wants to keep recruiting mostly Irish migrants, actually, that are coming in, and they're basically trying to siphon them off to Brazil. So he leaves Domingo de Goicuria, who was a Cuban reformer who had been exiled from Cuba, and who eventually gets executed by Garrote Vil in the 10 Years' War, almost as soon as it breaks out. And so these are connections that I think also push us to think beyond bilateral analysis of Brazil and the U.S. And of course, if we're thinking about rivers, both as metaphors and means, I think that there's something to be said about this important chronological watershed in the, say, first half of the 19th century, where internal navigation is crucial, because these are the avenues, right, for communicating this incredibly large empire. And then the second half, in which we already have steam coming into the picture and railroads becoming the horizon of expectation for Brazilian statesmen. So thank you for those questions. It was fantastic.
I will be very brief because I know we are running out of time. But I just wanted to also mention, perhaps connecting to Isadora's point, O'Brien is not here, but we can share that with him later, is that the U.S. Navy had a Brazil squadron stationed in the Brazilian coast in international wars, but very close to the Brazilian coast, because as historians have been showing, American ships or ships with American flags were being used to transport illegally enslaved people from Africa to Brazil. And so the U.S. stationed a squadron there to kind of try to block that in the exact same years as Weekly was visiting. So, of course, those ships were also sometimes funded by American capitalists. So there's that relation that goes, let's say, under the table sometimes. And that was exactly what the Brazilians were trying to do, like, using American ships to so that they would not have their cargo with enslaved peoples blocked from arriving in Brazil. So there's that. And also another point, I think, connecting to rivers. I really find rivers fascinating because apparently, as José Juan said, in the first half of the 19th century, there was a lot of imagination connecting to rivers. The first project of settling the Brazilian frontiers, rivers were crucial. It never happened, but they were everywhere. So if you look at the documents that José Bonifácio, the letters that he exchanged with his diplomats in Europe, they were like, okay, once the immigrants arrive in Brazil, we use the rivers to ship them inward. So there's that. And finally, I think that I completely agree with José Juan when he said, like, it takes three to tango, and we should not let Africa out of that equation as well.
Yeah. So, all right, guys, that's our second and final panel today. The moderator is Ben Bradlow. He's a professor of sociology and also the School of Public and International Affairs here at Princeton. He has a book coming out now, right, in a month or so, called Urban Power, on how cities address inequality, using as case study both São Paulo and Johannesburg in South Africa. So, Ben.
All right. Should I take a...
Yeah, so the...
So we have three great panelists for this last panel this morning on future horizons, but we're going to begin with a very eminent historian, Lilia Schwartz, who's professor of anthropology at University of Sao Paulo and visiting professor here at Princeton. She's a leading public intellectual in Brazil, and her research centers on the interface of art, anthropology, and history with a focus on racial relations and inequality in Brazil. We have a virtual speaker who's going to come to us from these screens. Juliano Assunção is the executive director of CPI PUC-Rio and professor in the Department of Economics at PUC-Rio. His research focuses on climate policies in Brazil through evidence-based analyses and direct engagement with policymakers and civil society, and he coordinates the Amazon 2030 project. And finally, Brian Winter, who we heard from a bit yesterday afternoon as well. He's the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly, and he's lived in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico as a correspondent for Reuters before taking on his current role at America's Quarterly in New York, where he's also the vice president of policy for the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. I'm going to hand it over to Lilia. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Brazil Lab, Miqueias, Carol, Thomas, Rodrigo, for this wonderful meeting. And thank you for all my companions here in this second panel. Juliano, that is in Brazil, and Brian, and Benjamin, thank you so much. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to talk about future. That was Miqueia's ideas. I'm not very good with futures. So I will do my best. Brazilian ambassador and historian Alberto da Costa Silva, a great specialist in African cultures and histories, entitled one of his books like this, A River Called Atlantic, rio chamado Atlântico. The idea was to show how the huge geographical space was also a philosophical one, cosmological, cultural one, and of course, a social space. In this river traveled persons, people, religions, ways of cooking, philosophies, forms of rebellion, rituals, agencies, cosmologies, and visual art. So in my presentation, I will focus the complex world created by the insidious and slave trade, but in terms of visual art. I do not intend to follow a chronological or geographical structure in a way to also avoid traditional classifications as popular art, naive art, opposed to just art. This is a space borrowing the title of the first and the second panel of present past and future horizons, better saying, of past future. Yes, we have art. It's a kind of alliteration of a famous expression created by Braguinha, Carlos Alberto Ferreira Braga, that composed a song called Yes, Nós Temos Bananas for the Carnival of '38. In the rhythm of Marchinha, the song used humor to criticize what the author called arrogance of the North Americans, that used to define Latin American countries as Repúblicas das Bananas. At least two Brazilian artists, Nelson Lerner and Paulo Nazaré, in different moments, and even the Biennial of Art of 1989 quoted the expression in the same critical way. And as Mario Pedrosa once said, it's always good to stay close to an artist. So let us stay close. As we know, Brazil is a central territory in these Afro-Atlantic histories, having received about 48% of the 10 million Africans that survived the Middle Passage, brought to the other side of the ocean during the transatlantic slave trade that lasted for more than 300 years. The country was also the last one to end slavery with a very conservative law that did not include any social integration plan, setting the stage for enduring economic, political, and racial inequalities. United States also have a special role in this triangle and in this kidnapping of Black people. But as Isadora mentioned, both countries had a very crucial role in the Black activism, and the fight for freedom. It's not a coincidence that in both countries the theme was often visited by artists in the past and in the present. Visual art can illuminate contradictions and can also rewrite the same history, introducing other perspectives, agencies, and forms of rebellion. I'm going to use some images that can convince by repetition. As Gombrich put it, one image talks to another image. So, one of the most impressive marks of this river called Atlantic was the so-called Middle Passage, this brutal triangle between Africa and the Americas, but also a place of flux and reflux, to use Pierre Verger, very well-known expression, Pierre Verger, that was himself a French ethnologist, photographer, and Babalawo, priest of Ifa, who made Bahia his home. Paul Gilroy proposed the notion of Black Atlantic, a fluid space with no specific frontiers or times, where African matrices infiltrate and transform cultures and territories in the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe, where the ocean becomes a liminal territory that challenges national frontiers, and the ship a potential symbol, as we saw in the first panel. A living microcultural and political system in motion. Not unintentionally, the nautical motif is present in a series of images that we are going to see now. For example, the German naturalist Johann Moritz Hugendas, that traveled to Brazil in the beginning of the 19th century, shows enslaved that seemed to be comfortably lodged in the hull of a slave ship. In a kind of guilty depiction, he transforms the lack of air and light in a metaphor of a Christian cross. Romantic and colonial images like this one are being reread and transformed by contemporary artists, giving other meanings to the same visual document. Rosana Paulino, that you are going to see, draws on the well-known plan and section of a slave ship, widely reproduced and used by both slave traders and pro-abolitionist campaigners. In her work, Paulino, the artist suggests a patchwork of images of brains, referring to the practice of craniology, as well as Portuguese tiles and photographs by the German-Brazilian August Style. Paulino's title, The Permanence of Structures, suggests that much of this argument is still widely disseminated and persistent in countries like Brazil and the United States, where racism is a kind of social contract. In another reference of a slave ship, and using the same propaganda, Emanuel Araújo's work called The Ship has arranged 31 wooden sculptures representing human figures carved using a traditional Yoruba technique. The general aspect of Shio also evokes traditional African sculptures, sharing formal similarities with Mambara, human figures carved in wood. Many other artists revisit the colonial images of a slave ship that I don't want to show it here, more than the one that I already showed. Paulo Nazaré transformed the document in a kind of stamp. José Alves de Olinda suggests that the slave ship brought not only workers, but also African cultures, religions, customs, and warriors, represented here by Eshu, a messenger, Orisha, who operates between spiritual and earthly plans. Carrie James Marshall depicts other kind of journey with Orishas, stars, and dreams. Radcliffe Bailey portrays a dark lawyer ocean from which ropes emerge to illustrate navigation routes between different Africas and the Americas. The image is a complex landscape populated by traditional African sculpture. The beautiful Into Bondages by Aaron Douglas was transformed in a symbol of Harlem Renaissance movement. In the middle of the canvas, the main character looks at a star, a symbol of hope and freedom, and a reference to the North Star, which guided runaway slaves toward freedom in the North. We are talking about rivers and roads. Hank Willis Thomas illustrates a fictional map of an Afro-American continent in a place to call home, Africa America, that recreates geographies in an emotional way. Finally, in the sequence of images, one large-scale textile by Ibrahim Muhammad shows modes of African representation and global displacement. The displacement of the material reflects the harshness of the trip and a sort of refugee against global transactions that cross north and south, east and west. Let me talk about another symbolic space, the slave market, here depicted by the French artist Jean-Baptiste Debré, that Michael showed previously. Debré employs a light palette oscillating between shades of beige and brown, apart from the trader's red pants. From the wall plasters to the wooden ceiling, the floor of burnt cement, nothing escapes the treatment of the artist who, in this case, certainly intended also to denounce the slave trade in a very ambiguous way. Debré's painting suggests a form of internal activism, didactically showing violence was a way to denounce the system. That was also the strategy of Thomas Satterwhite, who depicted the slave market in St. Louis, Missouri. Satterwhite was born in Kentucky in 1835 and showed an early interest in art. In 1853, he moved to New York and later to Paris, returning to the U.S. and served in the Confederate Army from 1862 to 1865. He then moved to St. Louis, where he saw success with one of his first canvas, Last Sale of Slaves, and established himself as a painter of abolitionist scenes, as that was what he used to call himself. From what we know, the event took place New Year's Day in 1861. The auction set to take place was interrupted by some 200 activists who invaded the sale and prevented it from going forward. This was to be the last auction in St. Louis, but Satterwhite tells a different story. The center of the canvas is occupied by the so-called Octoroon girl, who appears atop a platform carrying her child in her arms. She gazes tenderly toward her child and out toward the crowd. He draws attention to an apparent inversion of values. This new race is more sensitive than the whites. To the canvas left, 3 white men debate amongst themselves, hardly paying attention to the auction. The youngest teaches the other two about racial equality. Behind them, 3 black men similarly discuss amongst themselves. all fulfill a symbolic function representing a clash between generation, race, and ethics. The canvas, composed of a group of well-formed, balanced figures, is built from the play of shadow and light, which directs the viewer's attention to a white dog and to a boy who, at his father's side, observes the sales of a children like him. But Debré and Sutter-White seem to use art as activism, a way to denounce the naturalization of this trading in souls. It's notable, however, that in both works, enslaved are depicted as resigned, passive, none of them displaying a hint of revolt. This appears to be the limit and ambiguity of such works by 19th century abolitionist painters who centered white protagonists even when addressing Black issues. Let me introduce, in this sense, Nona Faustine. She creates portraits of herself in sites where slave market used to take place. In her exhibition, White Shoes, Faustine presented a series of 10 composite images. Each photo was taken at a different location in Manhattan or Brooklyn, including the Botanical Gardens, the New York State Supreme Court, and the Wall Street District. Reaching back in history, Faustine reminds us that the city was, for 200 years, the capital of the slave trade in the United States. Enslaved people were trafficked until 1827, when the institution was abolished in New York State. In the series, Faustine embodies the physical record of the countless anonymous women subjected to the slave master, or even she addressed to ethnographical photos or unidentified Black wet nurses. In this, she appears atop, in this photo, she appears atop a wooden pedestal that recalls the auction scene portrayed by Sutter-White. Faustine art reminds me the sugar shoes of Brazilian artist Tiago Santana, an allusion to the persistence of Black insubordination. Enslaved were not allowed in Brazil of wearing shoes. Even so, these fragile shoes made of sugar do not dissolve in water. I could talk about lots of themes or subjects to select, and I have some of them to select and compare, and I know I have no time for this. So I could talk about, let me just mention the subject of emancipation. The theme of emancipation is particularly depicted by different historical images that circulated across the continent, just showing how grateful enslaved had to be in front of the masters. This is such a repeated topic that became a convention, a visual convention among colonial countries that rooted the slave system. I'm not going to talk about Alexander Ripengeli, and I'm not talk about Alphonse Garot. I just want to try to compare with this kind of image of Isabel, the princess, giving freedom for a Black enslaved that respond kneeling in front of her, or even to mention this monument. This monument. Very eloquent is the similitude of these two monuments, one dedicated to President Lincoln, other to Prince Isabel, both delivering the same kind of message. Freedom is not an act of insubordination, but an act of continuity, of white protagonism. This is the opposite side of that image, Sidney Amaral talking about a Black abolition. So, putting different temporalities and geographies together, it's a way to avoid or to reconsider critically colonial and Eurocentric images and classifications disseminated all over the Afro-Atlantic diaspora. I'm going to finish just showing two images, one created by Theodor Kaufmann, a German painter that went to the United States and created this image called On to Liberty. And this image created by Biard, a French artist, that depicted the escape in Brazil. So but if in the first one they are going to the north, in the second one they are going to a black quilombo. So those are incomplete stories, but there is a beauty in incompleteness. It can show how difficult it is to tell stories that, as Saidiya Hartman points out, need a critical fabulation because of the silence of the colonial archives. Yes, we have art and bananas that connect and disconnect United States and Brazil in a very ambiguous and incomplete way that maybe can be imagined by our dream of past present and our projections of our present future. Thank you.
So let me start. Thank you for the opportunity for participating in this interesting event, and I'm so sorry that I will not be able to, that I haven't been able to be in person and to revisit so many friends and faces. And it's kind of hard to talk after such inspiring talk by Lily and with slides that are much more interesting than the ones that I put together here. But I'll try to do my best to not be, to be at least as fast as I can. And I'm going to talk about climate in Amazon in the context of Future Horizons. And it's a pleasure to bring this work here in particular because it's a work that was incubated pretty much in a former Princeton event, the Leapfrogging in Amazon. And that meeting was very important for us because it set the basis for this bigger project that I got involved that is called the Amazon 2030. And in the context of that project, we started this collaboration with José Schenkman, a former Princeton professor, current Princeton emeritus professor now at Columbia. So it's a kind of a natural and at the same time quite interesting to come back with a being able to somehow show you what you started here. Right, and all of the faults obviously are on my end. So let me start with the climate, just to help us to think through what are the challenges ahead of us. And I'm going to start with this graph from the IPCC that shows that our emissions curve is going up and up, except by the pandemic. We haven't been able to reduce emissions. Right. And something needs to be done because, according to the projections of IPCC, if you want to live in a safer world, we need to impose a sharp change in the emissions curve. Right. And when you look at these figures, you come up with a message that is quite clear that we need to change the amount of carbon that we are releasing in the atmosphere. But probably, reduce emissions will not be enough to put us in a safe condition. Probably we'll need to exploit ways of capturing carbon at scale. And this is exactly what I'm going to focus here, which is the opportunities that are provided by the so-called the natural climate solutions, right? That according to this paper, and there are many papers showing the potential of nature-based climate solutions, and also in particular the potential of carbon capture through forest restoration. And according to this paper, and others show similar messages, although the nature-based solutions cannot save us from the climate crisis, it can buy a significant time, right? And it can account for about 30% of what needs to be done, in the upcoming years. So it should be, an important piece of the solutions portfolio that we have in place. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to move substantially, significantly in that direction, right? So that's the piece of the climate that I'd like to pay attention. The climate needs some form of carbon capture at scale. And there is some research pointing to the potential of the so-called nature-based solutions as part of that portfolio, right? That's the climate piece. And let me talk about the Amazon, right? On the other hand, and how the Amazon is relating to the climate agenda, right? And I'm going to start with this other graph here, which shows that, on the horizontal axis, we have the economic activity measured by the GDP per capita. Each dot here is a different country or region, right? So you can see India, China, Europe, and United States. And you can see that all of these dots, they move pretty much along, a kind of a curve, right? And this curve is connecting the amount of activity that is taking place in each one of those areas of the road, and also the amount of carbon that has been, released in those areas. And in this context, you can see that Amazon is a huge outlier. It's totally out of, frame here. And if you take into account that this scale, they are in log terms, the Amazon is off by a factor of 10. So it, in order to be around here in the middle of its peers in terms of GDP per capita, the emissions should be 3 and not 30. What we observe there, right? So Amazon is quite off in terms of the amount of carbon that has been emitted there in comparison to the amount of economic activity that you observe in the region. So in a sense, what we have is this alignment between the climate change in the Amazon, right? So the way that the Amazon is relating to the climate change is contributing to the problem to be worse, right? And what's happening in the Amazon is important not only for the climate agenda, but also important for the forest itself, right? We have this paper that also, with José Schenkman, and that started, after that conversation, and it was published in the PNAS last year, in which it showed, and it's also with Marina Hirota, which is part of the Brazil lab as well. So we are all, in the same group here. And in this paper, we showed that, whenever we have a damage in the forest, because of the flying rivers, there is a kind of a domino effect. And the forest degradation, on average, tends to double, down the flying river. Right, so the impact of any kind of interference in terms of forest degradation, but the same will be true in terms of forest restoration. It tends to reinforce its impact, through the so-called flying rivers. That is, creates this damage. So the process of degrading the Amazon has a huge threat to the integrity of the forest itself. And there is this other paper that was published earlier this year that shows that they estimated that by 2050, between 10 to 47% of the Amazon rainforest will be exposed to disturbances that could trigger forest transitions that would exacerbate climate change. So we are really close to the so-called tipping point, and the forest is under a huge threat. So that's one of the important phenomena that are happening in the Amazon, which has consequences not only for the forest itself, but as it was shown in that event, in the leapfrogging event, it has global consequences, right? And this year in the Project 2030, we also published this work that was coordinated by my colleague Beto Verissimo, in which they look at the data from different indicators in Brazil. They computed the so-called Social Products Progress Index. And we can see here is that the Amazon, which is this region up north, is pretty red, which means that, even considering Brazil as a whole, Amazon is lagging behind in all dimensions of the social indicators, right? So what we have in the Amazon is this combination nowadays, of huge environmental degradation along with these limits to improve people's lives, right? So it's a pretty dramatic situation. And it is in this context that I'd like to think about future horizons, right? And here I'm gonna rely pretty much in one single aspect of the forest and the forest dynamics in particular, right? Which is the fact that, there is although we have been deforesting, a lot in terms of the Amazon, a substantial part of those areas has been abandoned. And in those areas, the forest is regrowing, right? Which are called the secondary vegetation. And this is a phenomenon that is happening at scale in the Amazon. About 1/5 of the whole deforested area in the Amazon is in some form of forest restoration, right? And if you consider a kind of a threshold of 6 years, which has some reasons to focus on 6 years, but if you consider this threshold of 6 years, you can locate 7.2 million hectares of secondary vegetation in the Amazon that is on this regeneration process for more than 6 years, right? So it's something that is happening in the Amazon, without any policy. There is nothing that is promoting this process to happen. It's just the ability of the forest. It's this combination of the ability of the forest to fight back, along with the dynamics of deforestation, which is much more extractive and associated with illegal grabbing rather than something that it has an economical rationale, right? So, and during this process, the average potential of carbon capture, the median potential carbon capture of a site in the Amazon has a curve that it has something like that. Per hectare, it has the ability to capture around 500 million tons of CO2 during, over time, right? So it's a very interesting observation when you take into account that, the kinds of economic activities that are replacing the forest on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to address climate change and to think about ways of restoring carbon capture, restoring the forest and implementing carbon capture at scale. Right, so I'm going to focus in particular on these specific phenomena, right? And secondary vegetation, it's something that it might not have the exact same properties of the primary forest, right? But from the point of view of carbon, it's quite good, and as close as we are from the original forest, the better is the quality of the forest restoration. So there is an interesting agenda to think about. And just as out of curiosity, my background here is a secondary vegetation within the Rio de Janeiro city where I live, and I took that picture. So that's a secondary vegetation could look something like what you can see behind my head here. So thinking about that, and I'm going to talk about a specific paper in which that paper can provide us a kind of a vision for the Amazon in the next 30 years. And this vision, this future horizon can be, and this is something that is feasible, it's achievable, and it would make economic sense, right? And this future will be about, that most of the economic activity in the region will be concentrated in cities. Nowadays, more than three-quarters of the population already lives in the cities. The jobs that are the sectors in which you have the highest growth rates in terms of job creation, they are urban jobs, right? So the economic dynamics of the Amazon nowadays is already a kind of an urban activity. And actually, if you look at the cattle ranch employment, has been declining over time, right? So we can think about the future in the Amazon in which the economic engine will be centered into the cities. Outside of the cities, what we'll have is this massive ecosystem restoration. The forest, massively restored, through this natural regeneration, along with the mechanism that I'm going to show you. We'll have the economic and the cattle range in agriculture restricted to areas in which it really makes sense, right? There are some areas in the Amazon that cattle ranching and crops, they are the best activities from an economic point of view, to take place there. And then in the rest of the rural areas, you have this the bioeconomy, right? The development of activities that will have, dealing with products that are compatible with the forest, right? So that's the kind of vision that is possible to think about the Amazon in the next 30 years. And the question is how to get there. And what are the windows of opportunities that we could exploit in order to get that kind of vision to happen, right? And then I'm going to talk about this paper that I mentioned before. That is a paper which was Schenkman, right, from Princeton and Columbia University, Lars Hansen from the University of Chicago, and Todd Munson, which is a computer scientist, in which we started to look at this problem in the Amazon, taking into account that every site of the Amazon has its own potential in terms of carbon capture, in terms of cattle ranching activities, right? And we're gonna ask one key question, in that scenario, and that the question will be, what would happen if the Amazon gets paid for the service of net carbon capture, right? So here we are not taking into account all of the other services that the forest provides to Brazil or to the rest of the world. We're going to focus, we're going to rely exclusively on the ability of the forest to implement carbon capture at scale, right? Given that potential. And the mechanism that you're going to exploit here is a very simple one. It's a mechanism in which, for every year, we're going to compute how much carbon was captured on a net basis. What is that? Is the amount of carbon that was captured through the forest restoration minus what was released through the deforestation. And if you get paid, a certain amount of dollars for a ton of carbon that has been captured, as Brazil, what would make sense, to implement in the region, right? That's the question that we analyze in this paper. With, as I said, we're taking into account that the current situation in the Amazon is that you have this extensive deforestation that took place in many areas of the Amazon. Our starting point is 2017, which is the year in which we have the latest agricultural census, from which we can estimate the potential for cattle ranching, revenue generation. We also take into account that every site of the Amazon has its own potential in terms of carbon capture and the potential of revenue generation, right? And then we look, and this is a model that we're taking into account the fact that all of this is measured with a lot of uncertainty. We're taking into account uncertainty around the prices of cattle, and we study, under different carbon price scenario, what would make sense to implement in the region. And when you look at that problem, we learn two things, right? The first one is that any carbon price for that service of carbon capture at scale, and notice here, we are not talking about avoided deforestation. We are talking about, the most premium service, which is about taking carbon out of the atmosphere and store it, in the form of forest, right? If you get paid $25 per ton of CO2 captured, Brazil will be better off. It makes sense to Brazil to join that mechanism, to accept that kind of offer. And given that offer, we would, transform a substantial part of the area that is currently deforested and is being used to very unproductive cattle ranching. This area will be put in forest restoration right away, right? And the amount and the scale of this possibility is huge. We are talking about 15 to 16 gigatons of CO2 equivalent captured in a period of 30 years. So that amount of carbon times the $25, which is the floor price for which Brazil makes sense to accept that offer. This would account for almost $400 billion in 30 years, and this is a significant amount of money to really transform the region, right? And at the same time provide, restore the ecosystem and provide this premium service of capturing carbon at scale, right, for the climate agenda. You can ask, what does it mean, $25? If you look around the world, there are, in the World Bank, they have this information about the carbon price that is embedded in different applications. Let's say in carbon markets in Europe, it's being negotiated around $90, $100. There's a lot of room for negotiation between the 25 and numbers like this. They are in this slide here. So we see that, this carbon mechanism and the idea of implementing forest restoration at scale in the Amazon is an opportunity not only to implement that vision that the Amazon will be a completely different fate than the ones that we have at this moment, but also this will be a way of realigning the climate change in the Amazon. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliano. Brian? Okay, so just this.
Oh, good. I'll still be able to see Juliano as I speak. Okay. Bom dia. Good morning. It's a privilege to be here with you today. I'm particularly honored to share a panel with two people who I hold in the highest esteem. Lily, who's the author of, I think, the best one-volume modern history of Brazil, and Juliano, who wrote one of the finest recent cover stories for America's Quarterly, which is the publication that I edit, about the potential future for this bioeconomy. I have really enjoyed and learned a lot from all these presentations. I have to confess to you that I am the student who took the assignment literally and prepared some remarks about the future of U.S.-Brazil relations. I do not have a PowerPoint, so I guess that fully makes me the black sheep of this event. But let me start by talking to you about one possible future in the near term for the United States and Brazil. And I don't want to scare anybody, but I do want to get your attention. So let me talk a little bit about this scenario. Right now, as we speak, there is a group of Brazilians, some of them in South Florida, who are using their contacts inside the Trump circle in order to convince people very close to former President Trump that Brazil is a communist dictatorship. They are, of course, using the recent dispute over X, some of the press coverage around that, invoking the name of Elon Musk a lot. But this effort did not begin, nor will it end, with the specific controversy. They have been saying this since the 2022 election, which, of course, they see as illegitimate. This includes names that are in the public domain, people who are influencers in the Bolsonarista space, and they have real channels to people like Steve Bannon, who you all know, and Jason Miller, who is another figure in the Trump space who's very influential, very present in the U.S. media a lot, and who does have some knowledge of Brazil. And they are trying to convince a future Trump administration that Brazil has already gone off the democratic path, and that therefore one of the first things that a Trump administration should do if they return in January is to pass sanctions against Brazil. I don't think this is a likely outcome. I do think it's very possible. I'm not trying to handicap who will win the U.S. election. I think that there would be people in a future Trump administration who would probably see things differently as to make it clear. I do. Okay. But it's also true, everything indicates that a second Trump administration will have fewer of the guardrails and fewer of the more moderate, constructive voices, people like John Kelly, H.R. McMaster, and Rex Tillerson, who were some of the more reasonable voices, in my view, in the first Trump administration. Everything indicates that he will be more surrounded by true believers who might be susceptible to this kind of view. And so I, at the same time, I don't think that this potential future, and by future, we're talking about, 4 months from now, 5 months from now, it's unlikely, but it's possible. And, I think this shows us at some level how precarious the U.S.-Brazil relationship still is today, even after 200 years. I believe that things are at something of a high point right now, as I said at the event last night with Ambassador Viochi. But you can imagine a future in the near term that is completely different, and that's a problem. And, I think it's partly a product of the polarization in both of our countries. But I think it's also a product of the lack of connective tissue between the two countries as well. Even though there are so many things in common, and we've touched on a lot of the shared history today. All of these presentations have focused on at some level as, on the shared history of slavery. There are also two large democracies. But despite that, there's a history of not fully understanding each other and not seeing eye to eye. I do think this is getting better. We've come a long way since 1982 when Ronald Reagan stood on a stage in Brasilia, having been invited by the dictatorship at the time with a state dinner. And Reagan raised his glass and proposed a toast to the people of Bolivia. I think we've even come a long way since 2013 when there were plans for a state visit by the then President Dilma Rousseff that were then canceled because of the eruption of the Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and the revelations about spying, espionage at the National Security Agency. I would point in the positive column to the experience of what happened in 2022 when the Biden administration was able to support Brazilian democracy and use both public and private channels to try to dissuade certain actors in Brazil, including some elements within the military, from going along with what we now know were Bolsonaro's real attempts to either cancel or otherwise subvert the election. I think it's important to say in that context that what protected Brazilian democracy above all was Brazilian institutions and Brazilian actors. That was by far the most important element. But having that support from the Biden administration and from the global community more generally was also an important part of the story. And I, as an American who has followed Brazil for a long time, I was personally glad to see it happen because I believe in democracy, and I think it was also a healthy counterexample that at some level blew the minds of people, particularly on the left, who think that the United States only supports right-wing dictatorships in Latin America. This was a clear case of the U.S. pushing for a democratic outcome. It's also true that in 2023, when President Lula visited the White House, President Biden made a point of saying that he saw Brazil not as a regional power, but a global power. This was intentional language that was inserted in the president's, as part of their private conversation. But it was the sort of declaration that I understand, reverberated well for President Lula and in Brazil more generally. There's also real cooperation today around issues like the G20, climate change, defense of democracies, as I mentioned, global hunger, and some other things that are part of the G20 agenda. But look, so those are some examples of progress, but this all coexists still with a certain either ignorance or lack of understanding I'll never forget, I had a conversation when I was still working as a reporter. This was now 10 years ago, so take it with a grain of salt if you want, but with someone senior in the Obama administration who said to me, we still haven't figured out if Brazil is Britain or France. It's France. I mean, it's Brazil, but I don't think I need to explain what that means. And as I said last night, I think the fact that there is a large democracy in Latin America that acts based on its own interests, that is not automatically aligned with or aligned against the United States, sometimes does not compute to American ears, especially in Washington. And, as an extension of that, sometimes we disagree. I mean, sometimes there are disagreements between the United States and Brazil, just as there are, to take that example, as there are between the United States and France. And it's normal. It's okay. But it's still like that notion is still, after all these years and despite all this progress, which I think is real, it's hard for some people in Washington to get their heads around. Why is that the case? I think that many of the people who follow Latin America tend to be focused on the Spanish-speaking part of the region. If they come from the generation that kind of grew up in the 1980s, they kind of cut their teeth on the Central American wars at the time. They tend to know Cuba very well, but they don't know Brazil. In the 1990s and the 2000s, I think that there was more of a focus on Colombia. I think more recently there's been a focus on Venezuela. There are quality people within the bureaucracy in Washington who do understand Brazil, but there should be more. Because the fact that we have so many people with experience in the Spanish-speaking countries, and a place like Venezuela, Cuba, those are important countries. But Brazil is 40% of Latin America's population and GDP. And the fact that you don't regularly have people who are focused on Brazil running the Latin American diplomacy portfolios is mind-blowing. In what other area of the world would that be acceptable? Where else, for East Asia, for example, would you exclude people who knew China? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, even though I understand why it's the case. I also think that, national security types, because of their jobs, they tend to see Latin America through the lens of a threat rather than an opportunity. And what that means in practice is that they're focusing on migration and drugs, and they don't have that much time to think on a day-to-day basis about Brazil. I've been told this by people in the diplomatic community. They said, it just doesn't, we wish that we could take the time to focus more, but it just doesn't, on a day-to-day basis, we're looking at other issues. I think that reflects a bigger problem in how things are organized, but that's just my opinion. Let me look at the other side of this, just to be fair. Dan Restrepo, who was the Obama administration's point person for Latin America, he once told me for an article I reported that with the possible exception of Argentina, he said there's no other country in Latin America whose senior leaders, not diplomats, senior leaders have spent so little time in the United States. I think you have also, I think it's fair to say, a left that is sometimes more focused on the 20th century than on the 21st when it comes to the U.S.'s role in the world. And there's another element which got touched on at the event last night, and it has to do with the subject of race. And this is a topic that I think it's important for any American talking about Brazil to approach with humility. I always try to recognize this. But, as was highlighted last night, it's a diplomatic corps in Brazil that does not fully reflect the Brazilian population. It's very white, it's very male. And I know this is a priority for the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. It's a challenge for the United States as well. I believe it was said at the event last night that there are 2 black ambassadors right now for Brazil. I think in the United States, it's about 10. But I watch all these presentations today about the shared history of slavery, and I suspect I wonder if a more diverse diplomatic corps in both countries would result in the kind of greater understanding and connectivity that we're talking about here because of those shared experiences. I know it's a goal that both countries have and are working towards. Just to wrap up here, I do think that some of this connectivity that we're talking about is happening on other levels outside of governments. It may be fair to say that there's never been more exchange at kind of the grassroots level between the United States and Brazil as there is right now. That's because of changes in tourism, trade, and religion as well. We've had a boom in air traffic over the last 20 years in Brazil. I'm sure everybody here knows this story, but the passenger traffic has tripled. That's partly a result of the growth of the Brazilian middle class, especially during the 2000s. And a lot of that passenger traffic has been to the United States. I'll never forget, and it still happens, you can stand sometimes in the airport in Miami at a certain time of night, and all of the flights are going to Brazil. And that was not the case when I first started traveling to the region in the early 2000s. We also have, as I mentioned, an evangelical community in Brazil that is large and growing and very connected to the United States. I'm sure everybody in here knows this number, but just in case you don't, the evangelical community was 8% of the Brazilian population in the 1980s. Today, it's closer to 35%. And there are statisticians at the IBGE who believe that evangelicals could be the majority by 2035. The connectivity among mega churches and also just at the social media level among those communities is real. It explains a lot of the politics, especially on the right as well. And, partly as a result of these, connections, Brazil is, by global standards, a country where people tend to have positive views of the United States. There was a Pew Research poll that came out in 2023 that showed that 63% of Brazilians have a positive view of the U.S. That was higher than the 51% in Argentina. The global average is 59%. And you have a generation that knows the U.S., and of course, political ideas go back and forth. So just to conclude here, back to my original question, how do we increase that connectivity and try to ensure that the next 200 years of relations are marked by more understanding and less prone to these kinds of potential deviations that I mentioned at the beginning? And I have a simple answer to this, not the only answer, but I think we have to look at our human resources. I think we have to look at the HR on this and make an intentional effort at the kind of cultural exchange and events like this one that are really designed to improve those contacts and that kind of understanding. I think this event, as others that I've attended here, has been very positive. I see sometimes at events in New York especially, Brazil events often end up being attended by Brazilians. And that is a challenge. And what I mean is not only Brazilians, but the percentage is very high. And I think, I go to a variety, the organization I work for, the American Society, Council of the Americas, we convene events. I see events in New York all the time that are sort of pan-regional. But it's Brazil where, and they have this week called Brazil Week, which is organized around the Brazilian American Chamber that holds its annual conference. And all of, a certain segment of Brazil comes to New York. Everybody, I don't even know how they have enough air tickets to sort of accommodate all these people who come. And they have these events that are almost entirely Brazilians. It's like everybody comes from Sao Paulo and Rio, right? And there's nobody else. And I think that's a missed opportunity in some ways. And I think there needs to be more of an effort to sometimes at events like that to make sure that there are non-Brazilians there. But I think also, I think it falls to the academy as well, to universities. I think the need to be out there in the real world as part of these debates is important. And I appreciate the academic role of what happens in universities, but so much of the knowledge, so much of the understanding is here. And so, sometimes I again, humbly, I see a tendency to sort of turn inward. And no, I think people in places like this have a role to play in this kind of understanding that I'm trying to talk about. So I think, again, if we can have more people participating in diplomacy, cultural exchanges, and public life in general, I think we can try to ensure the next 200 years are marked by even more understanding than we have today. Thank you very much.
Thanks to the three of you for really quite a range of perspectives on how we move from this long history of in the 19th century to the 21st. I have a couple questions, but I want to open it up first to see if there are questions in the audience, and I'll save mine. Yes, the consul.
Not exactly a question. Good morning, everyone. It's more some comments. First of all, to say that I'm very happy as consulate, and I'm sure that Ambassador Maria Luisa Viotti is happy as well. She told me yesterday after we left dinner. Are you hearing? Or too low? Okay. I was saying that I'm very happy, and I'm sure that Ambassador Maria Luisa Viotti as well was very happy with this workshop, this gathering here. Maybe we should make it traditional in every year, repeat it. We are trying to work with the universities, and you are right, Brian, that this is a task of everyone. I thought that the presentations today were very enlightening, at least for me. I learned a lot. And I'm not dare to comment on the previous presentation because you are so expert. You have such expertise on it that I just was really happy to hear you all speaking. But I do want to comment on some of your presentations points, Brian. And first of all, in general, I agree with you in all points, especially in the lack of knowledge here in the United States regarding Brazil. And I had the opportunity in California to have extreme meetings with the vice governor who is responsible for the international relations. And I mentioned it yesterday in terms of culture, how is different, like you promote culture in every region of the United States, a Brazilian culture. And I will not speak about it now because it is a long story, and it's related in some way in this, to this book, American Nations, and that speaks about, tells about the differences also in the regions in the United States and the communities that reflect upon all these different cultures here as well in the United States. But in these meetings with the vice governor in California, she said, look, Ambassador, really, she was an ambassador for the United States as well. I don't remember which country. And she said, you are right. I recognize that here in California, people do not know nothing about Brazil except in the research and innovation community. There are many Brazilian companies and people working with the companies. But except that, even in agriculture, we organized a seminar on agriculture. Brazil is a powerhouse. probably the most dynamic country in terms of exports in agriculture, and people don't know the development of Brazil in agriculture. So, but this is also a responsibility of us Brazilians. First of all, we do not know how to present correctly our narrative. There is a lack of more integration in all levels with the United States, not only diplomacy, but university. I think maybe university would be the sector most integrated, maybe. But even so, there is a huge potential for more. I visited the University of Seattle, which is a beautiful university with science department very developed and basically no cooperation with Brazil. So Congress, I don't see a connection between both. Congress, very few meetings, and maybe is the hardest part for us is to make Brazil known to the congressman and change some narratives based on lack of knowledge. And also, I agree with you, Brian, that the relation in some ways is more based on fears and not saying threat, but in fears and misinformation than in opportunities. But this I am very optimistic now, based on the opportunities that we have for the future in some sectors that Brazil will play, and sorry for the lack of humility, a major role in the world. And the United States is perceiving that, and the economic sector in general, with the support of the government, is trying to integrate more the economies. I was in San Francisco when this rupture of the production value chains was beginning. It was not beginning, but was accelerating. At the first moment, especially the information technological companies, they did not want to acknowledge it because the disinvestment and investment in other countries are so huge, are so costly, that they wanted to keep the investments in China, or at least the borders of China. But now, with this geopolitical situation being more profound, every company is seeing Latin America as an opportunity, and especially Brazil. We have been meeting. I don't know if I could tell you about that because it was a reserved meeting with Goldman Sachs. They are willing to work with all the companies, the technological companies, to invest in Brazil, for example, in data centers because of our capacity in the future in clean energy. And in Brazil, as I was saying, we will play a major role in clean energy, in bioeconomy, and other sectors because of the abundance of resources, because our advance in technology. So, because of this, I don't think that we could have. You said that's not a probability, but it's a possibility. I don't see a possibility or have a deviation of a good relationship. We could have more differences, but the economic sector will not allow, let's say, distance, getting more distant. Maybe in some areas, let's say sustainability and environment could have, but it's so strong, the potential for clean energy, the need for clean energy, including for the technological industry, because they cannot look, for example, and implanting data centers and many other industries, and the new capacities that the artificial intelligence will require for developing, they will have to rely upon clean energy. So this economic integration that I'm seeing and will make our relations more integrated than based on threat, not threats, I would say, but on fears, will prevail. And I hope so. And beyond that, it's not also, and this is a general discussion, not only Brazil, the United States. I don't see, let's say, this kind of modifications or the different shape in terms of Brazil-U.S. relations that you said. This will go beyond Brazil. If there is this kind of thinking, this will go really beyond Brazil. And no, at least I cannot say which would be the consequences, let's say, of much more isolated United States with tariffs, that's blocking the whole international trade and so on, because the other countries would try to compensate. I prefer not to see this scenario, but it is possible. But anyway, I think that in terms of Brazil and United States relation, the economic integration will be stronger than any kind of a different approach that we could have.
Yeah, we can take a question.
Thanks, and good morning. My name is Tobin Nelson. I'm a graduate student at SPIA, taking a sabbatical of sorts from my day job as a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State, so thanks for being here. I remember a time about 2010, 2012, when it seemed like the U.S.-Brazil relationship was poised to just take off. The U.S. was opening consulates left and right. We had Tom Shannon as ambassador, Todd Chapman as our DCM, and it didn't happen. So I'm curious, from your perspective, if you have thoughts on why that didn't happen, if it was perhaps a change in direction from the Dilma administration or the Snowden leaks or something on our side. And I ask in thinking of perhaps if there's a way to recapture that magic that seemed to really be there at that brief window. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So my question connects to something that Lily and Brian mentioned. That is this kind of, I'm picking back on something that we discussed over break with some of our historians colleagues in the room on like this unequal exchange between Brazil and the US and how to make better impact and perhaps be better understood here. It connects, Brian, to your point of, okay, go to events in New York about Brazil and there are only Brazilians. I think there are some lessons from the past, especially in terms of music. We have Paula here, and I remember like just before boarding to Portugal last June, I went to Esperanza Spalding's concert here in Princeton, and the first song that she sang was actually a Milton Nascimento song. And of course, we have the whole history between bossa nova and jazz. And we see, at least in New York, some of art shows featuring solo Brazilian exhibitions. So my question actually to Lily is, how do you see the American visual arts reacting and having a dialogue or not having a dialogue, only bringing, and that's it, especially Afro-Brazilian artists to the US? And if a dialogue is happening, or it's only part of like road music or road art, and not, how fruitful is the dialogue in the end? I think that's my question.
If I can exercise my prerogative and just put one short additional question on the table, because we're going to have to, I think we only have time for one round of questions. I want to ask about something that a official people in the room likely wouldn't ask about, which is the Pacific. We've talked a lot about the Atlantic, and it seems to me, particularly when Brian brings up the independent streak of a large democracy in the Americas, that is Brazil, that sometimes confounds the U.S., is that we're in a world now where the Pacific, and particularly China, is a very different kind of pole for thinking about configurations of power across the globe. And in each of your presentations, it seems like this might have some implications. So first, and perhaps most obviously, it's in this area of sustainability and an energy transition, where China is by far the leader compared to the United States. And I'm wondering how that presents itself in thinking about futures for the Amazon. Certainly in terms of thinking about the uses of history and the visualizations of history, I'm wondering if there's a turn to China in how Brazilian artists are thinking about this history. And then finally, I mean, this is central to a lot of what Brian is discussing in terms of the kind of short-term and medium-term politics of the future for Brazil. Where is the orientation really? Hope for the U.S. really what's most important, or is an orientation towards China something that's perhaps more enabling for Brazilian futures? I think this is the only microphone that's working. So,
these are big, difficult questions, and we only have a couple of minutes. Trying to organize my thoughts. So the first one, like basically what happened in 2013, really? I mean, look, I was there. I was working as a reporter. I was talking to both sides a lot as that was falling apart. And it's true, there were so many hopes for that visit. For those of you who don't know, and I referenced it during the presentation, but Dilma Rousseff was going to visit Washington for a state visit. It was going to be one of only, I think, 2 state visits that year. It would have been the first state visit since 1995, is that right? I think since FHC went very early and was received by Bill Clinton. And it fell apart because of the revelations of Edward Snowden. And I think, look, there were some structural factors. There were some very specific things, such as the fact that Glenn Greenwald was in Brazil. And so there was a focus, there was a Brazilian sort of emphasis in some of the leaks that came out, partly as a result of that. And it was very specific revelations of espionage on Petrobras, and as I recall, on the president herself. And this deeply offended the Brazilian government. And I certainly understood why. But beyond the sort of circumstantial details of that moment, I look over the last 10 years and I think that, and like, I'm just going to speak directly here. I think that particularly within Democratic Party administrations, I think there's this greater respect and appreciation and understanding of Brazil that I was referencing in my remarks. I think that grew partly as a result of that incident. I think that the world has become somewhat more multipolar since then. I think there's an appreciation of that and I'm choosing words not carefully, but I don't think you see what I just said. I don't think it's as true of kind of the Republican Party foreign policy establishment. They have a very different way of seeing this. But amongst in the Democratic Party, I think and in the diplomatic corps, I think you see more respect for Brazil and the role it can play. And just to cite a specific example of that, to make it clear that I'm not just sort of spouting platitudes, I would point to what's happened over the last 6 weeks with the crisis in Venezuela, where the Biden administration has helped create space for the Lula government and the Petro government in Colombia to really take the lead in terms of trying to talk to the Venezuelan dictatorship. And, it hasn't succeeded in the sense that we have not seen a lessening of repression. We've certainly not seen a democratic transition, nor do I think we will. But I don't believe that the United States in either party would have been content with that kind of dynamic, to essentially take a bit of a back seat when it came to that. I think that shows that journey that they've been on for the last 10 years. I guess to complete that thought, to me, and maybe this is an oversimplification, but what the Brazilian government has always wanted, in my view, from U.S. governments is respect and a recognition of Brazil's size, weight, independence, and national interests. And so in that sense, I think that this is a moment that shows you that there has been some positive change. But again, to be really clear, that's not generalized throughout the U.S. body politic. And I think if we see a Republican administration next year, I think the scenario would be very different. And with regard to what the consul said, my only reservation is, yes, there are economic linkages between the Brazil and the U.S. that will hold the countries together, but that's way more true of Mexico and the United States. And that's a relationship that I think is even more fragile in some ways right now than the U.S. and at greater risk than the U.S.-Brazil relationship, even though the linkages are vastly bigger by multiples of, I don't know the exact numbers, but the amount of trade, for example, is vastly larger between the U.S. and Mexico. And I think that's a relationship that could be in real trouble by early next year because of the renegotiation of USMCA, because of tensions over immigration and fentanyl, and the potential for unilateral U.S. military action, which is something that is now a mainstream idea in the Republican Party. And then just quickly on China. How do you talk quickly about China? I think the change in orientation that I've seen in Brazil over the last 20 years reflects the growth in the commercial relationship between Brazil and China. China, of course, is now Brazil's biggest trading partner. I think that the idea that there's another system out there appeals to some politicians in Brazil. I think that I think there's a belief, particularly in my experience in the diplomatic corps, that a truly multipolar world would be better for Brazil, that the unipolar moment of the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War has not been ideal for Brazil. I have my own feelings about this, but I think there's a view that both China and Russia, regrettably in my view, are tools that can be used to usher the world along to a more multipolar world in which Brazil would have a bigger voice in global governance and in other areas. My only caveat, the only caveat that I'll express here today is I find in Brasilia a view that China is ascendant and the United States is in decline. 5 years ago, I believed this. I'm not sure I believe it today. And I'm not sure, and it's because of changes demographics and in the economies of both countries. So I wonder sometimes if some of my friends in Brazil are a little bit behind the curve in terms of understanding where we're really headed. So with that.
Can we pass it to Juliano quickly, and then we'll end with but we're over time. So sorry. Can you unmute yourself? Can you hear us? How do I unmute your?
I can unmute myself, yeah. I couldn't follow the discussion. Sorry, my sound here is pretty poor.
Okay. Yeah, maybe. Why don't you?
here? I think so. Okay, let me start talking. I'm very pessimist in the present and optimist in the future. That's a good position because we are always saying, okay, it will happen, it will happen. So, Micaeus, part of my presentation was based in an exhibition that we opened first in São Paulo, at MASP, Museu de Arte de São Paulo, and Instituto Tomiotaki. The name of this exhibition was Afro-Atlantic Histories, Histórias Afro-Atlânticas. That was part of a large project of histories. We started with histories of childhood and then histories of sexuality and histories of, and so on and so on. When we presented to the board Histórias Afro-Atlânticas, they said it will be a disaster. We are not going to have sponsors, we are not going to have, the people will not come to the museum. And what happened? The opposite. It was a very important exhibition. And it was the first time that New York Times selected Histórias Afro-Atlânticas as the #1 exhibition in that year. And then Histórias Afro-Atlânticas traveled to the other side. We are very used to receive exhibitions coming from United States. And Histórias Afro-Atlânticas is still went to Washington and then to LA and then so maybe it's another position in the future, not now, but maybe if you think about art, something is happening. I can see it happening in galleries. I can see, for example, I can use one example, Dalton Paula. Dalton Paula, it's an artist coming from Goiânia. Nobody knew him. Adriano Pedrosa and I showed him in Histórias Mestiças in 2014. Then Dalton Paula was in Histórias Afro-Atlânticas with two very important portraits, one of Zeferina, a leader of a Quilombo, not far from Salvador, very dangerous one, Quilombo do Urubu. No? And then she became a kind of symbol. And Dalton Paula was immediately hired for a gallery here in New York, based in New York and Chicago. And he worked here for more than he wanted because he was kept here during pandemic. And then he had this big show at MASP. And then MoMA bought 12 paintings. So that's brand new. And he had an exhibition at MoMA. So future is next. And I can give you another example that is Adriano Pedrosa that was invited as a curator of Venice Curator. It's the first time that we have a Latin American curator. So in my opinion, things are changing. Talking about China, it's not changing. And I mean, in the fields of art, I think we have now a big discussion about indigenous art that was called popular art or naive art or art craft. And in my opinion, names are not naive. They are forms of classifications, no? And I think we are looking toward Asia, but mainly in Japan, because of the huge immigration we had mainly in São Paulo during the 19th century at the end of the slave system, when Japanese people came to work. Maybe that can change. And then I want to address it's not a response, but it's just a commentary of the idea that we need more events that when we talk about Brazil, that Brazilians will come, but other people will come. And I think that part of it is mainly in the university. It's connected with us because in Brazil we have a system of classification called Lattes. You know about it? So all the academics you have to show your production at Lattes. And I call Homo Lattes but it's a very internal thing. And if you are a curator of an exhibition, we cannot put it, if you are if you work in art, you will be recognized because you are. You can say, oh, I know I opened an exhibition. But if you are a person like me that works at social science or in history, I can't do that. I opened that exhibition, but it will not count for nothing. And Homo Lattes do not count if we have an Instagram, for example. And I started my Instagram. Nobody would talk about my Instagram in the academia. It's like, wow, it's changing now. But it wasn't like this. And Homo Lattes, you have nothing. You cannot. There is not a space for you to put. And you know why I started my Instagram? That was very good because we had a former minister of education. He was not a minister of education. He wasn't at all. Weintraub. And I remember listening to him, and he said something like this. Can you imagine if you have a son or a daughter, you work in the fields, you are a very poor man. He just talked about men because women, we do not exist, no? And you are a poor man, you work in the fields your whole life, and then you work a lot because you want your son, not your daughter, to enter the university. And he enters. And then he goes to you and say, okay, father, I want to be an anthropologist. That's a disaster. So I tried to go to Instagram to show what academia can do for us, no? In this sense. And I think it's important to go public. I agree completely with you. And I think we have to have an ontological turn in this sense. Very important what you said. Very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are out of time, unfortunately. We are already 15 minutes over time. So I want to thank you, everybody, for coming. If you want to know more about our work, just go to brazillab.princeton.edu, join our mailing list, and we usually host 2 events per month. So I hope to see you again here.